Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead on AM 530 at 1:30 p.m. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'm the Communications Director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, a pro-life organization that works here in Canada to change public opinion on this most serious of moral issues. If you want to check out our blog articles or our activism or more of the radio shows that we've recorded in the past, check us out at unmaskingchoice.ca. You can also sign up on iTunes to get this program sent to you weekly. Well, the interview we have for you today is with a man named Clarke Forsythe. He's the senior counsel for Americans United for Life and one of the most preeminent scholars on pro-life issues, and especially pro-life issues as they relate to the political realm. His most recent book is Abuse of Discretion, The Inside Story of Roe v. Wade, which I talk with him a bit about in the interview. And one of the other books that he's written that I extensively discuss with him is Politics for the Greatest Good, The Case for Prudence in the Public Square, where Clarke Forsythe really tackles some of the stickier issues surrounding how we as pro-lifers fighting against abortion, which is an issue very much in some ways of morality, how we can deal with this issue in the public square where, pragmatism often rules the day. Clarke Forsythe has been published in many prominent publications, especially across the U.S., and First Things, the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Times. These papers have all quoted him quite extensively. So we're really quite privileged to have Clarke Forsythe on with us today to discuss issues that really do relate very much to the Canadian political situation as well. So we hope that you enjoy his insights. First, I want to talk to you about your book, Politics for the Greatest Good, because of how it really lays out how pro-lifers should deal with the political sphere. But first, your newest book, Abuse of Discretion, The Inside Story of Roe v. Wade, has been getting quite a bit of discussions really lately. Can you just tell us a bit about what you describe in that book?
Well, I wrote Abuse of Discretion because I had the opportunity to look at the personal papers of 8 of the 9 justices who voted in Roe versus Wade, and they tell a completely different story about how Roe versus Wade was created than anybody has ever heard before. And they show the mistakes and misjudgments by the Supreme Court that created Roe versus Wade and the 41 years of turmoil we've had in the United States in law and politics because the court overreached and created a national public policy on abortion in the U.S. that is way out of line with international standards and way out of line with public opinion. As you know, Canada and the U.S. and China and North Korea are the only 4 nations of 195 around the globe that allow abortion for any reason at any time.
Right.
And in the U.S., that's directly imposed by the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, the 2 Supreme Court decisions.
Right.
So Abuse of Discretion is the most important book written about Roe since Roe because these papers of the justices have been released to the public over the last 10 years. And they tell a completely different story than anybody's ever heard before.
Right. In those papers that you had a chance to go through, what was the one thing that surprised you the most?
Well, there are a lot of things, but two things, I suppose. Well, 3 things jumped out. Number one, I was surprised that there was no trial, no evidentiary record, no factual record in the cases, so that the justices were flying by the seat of their pants and were just making up their abortion doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, they were susceptible to untested theories of law and medicine and history, and they latched onto this notion that abortion was safer than childbirth.
Right.
And that pretty much drove the outcome. But there was no reliable data to show that. And there was no existing obstetrical textbook that made that claim in 1971-72. And then the third thing that most surprised me, I suppose, was that they created this viability rule, but that was never briefed or argued in the Supreme Court, and You can actually go to a website, oyez.org, oyez.org, listen to the original audio, and you can read the transcripts of the arguments. And the word viability wasn't even mentioned once in all of the oral arguments. The justices started negotiating behind the scenes as to the sweep of the abortion right they were creating, and they latched on to this notion that abortion should be legal to fetal viability and then beyond. And they just created it behind the scenes between themselves.
Right, so that's sort of how, these abortion wars, began in the U.S. Here in Canada, as I'm sure you know, in 1988, our abortion laws were struck down. The Canadian Parliament tried to address the issue in 1991 by passing another law. That law was deemed unsatisfactory by both the pro-abortion side and by many members of the pro-life side. It subsequently failed, and we've been without a law ever since. So here's where I really want to get into the ongoing debate inside the pro-life movement. This is a debate happening in both Canada and the U.S., and it's between those who feel that incremental laws, especially gestational restrictions, are unethical or immoral, and those who seek to restrict evil to the greatest extent possible and see this as the most tenable way forward. So you've written about this quite extensively. I think more extensively than any other scholar I've really seen. How do you view this issue?
I think we have to go back to the cardinal virtue of prudence. It is the premier political virtue. It is the preeminent of the cardinal virtues. It judges in any particular circumstance what is courageous or just or temperate. It is the first of the political virtues, and we have to be anchored by it and taught by it. I hate the term incrementalism because it suggests some kind of an ideological or religious compulsion to incrementalism or to an incrementalist approach. What's more important than incrementalism is prudence. Prudence, in any particular situation, you could look at an incremental strategy, but it always has to be judged by, is it prudent? And if you break down prudence or into its constituent parts, there are kind of four parts to it, as I lay out in Politics for the Greatest Good. Prudence isn't pragmatism because it is always oriented toward moral purpose and good goals.
Right.
Secondly, you have to have wise judgment as to what's possible given the countervailing obstacles. Third, you have to effectively connect means and ends. And fourth, and finally, you have to avoid a final compromise that prevents future progress and always preserve the possibility of future progress when more of the good is achievable and the obstacles have been overcome. Those four factors are the essence of political prudence.
Right.
And I think to take it at the next step, I think we have to understand that we don't work in a vacuum. We work in the teeth of countervailing obstacles and limits, metaphysical, political, and practical, and those are what prevent us from achieving the perfect or achieving a great good at any particular time. Those are legal obstacles, constitutional obstacles, financial obstacles, political obstacles, legislative obstacles. They are what limit us, not our desires.
Right.
They are what limit us. And next, we have to have a real clear understanding of what is a compromise and what isn't a compromise. The word compromise is thrown around like pennies, point where it doesn't mean anything. A compromise is giving something up to reach an agreement.
Right.
Giving something up to reach an agreement. But if you don't have anything to give up, if you don't own anything or possess anything to begin with, you're not giving up anything. You're not making a concession. A compromise is a mutual concession to reach an agreement.
Right.
But if you don't have anything to give up, you don't have anything to concede. And most of the time in legislative battles, it's not a question of compromise, giving up anything or making any concession. It's fighting tooth and nail for 51% of the vote.
Right. Well, and this is what I've often brought up in the Canadian context in our discussion here about what types of legislation would be permissible, because there are those who feel that gestational type restrictions, which might be politically viable at some point, are immoral, and there are those of us, such as myself, who believe that these types of restrictions are the only way forward. And what I often say about the term compromise legislation, which is what those who oppose gestational restrictions often use, is that when abortion is legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, and you manage to get a ban, say at 24 weeks or at 12 weeks, that's all take and no give. That's not actually a compromise. That's us, adding to the number of children that can be saved, but in no way subtracting from the number that can be saved.
Well, I would pose two questions. If you have a social evil, whether it's the slave trade or abortion or prostitution, can you eliminate it completely all at once? Mm-hmm. If you can't, then you gotta, because of obstacles beyond your control, then the question is, what limits can you put on it?
Right.
And are those limits part of an overall vision? I mean, in Politics for the Greatest Good, I have a chapter on Wilberforce.
Yes.
And Wilberforce combined a long-term vision of complete justice with short-term limits. And it wasn't one or the other, it was both, and.
Right.
His goal was to eliminate the slave trade and then to turn to emancipate the slaves.
Right.
And he had that long-term vision, and he tried for complete prohibitions, but he combined those with short-term, the greatest limits he could achieve, given the obstacles in front of him. Mm-hmm. And the limits, I mean, let's say you couldn't prohibit every abortion in Canada. What kind of limits then would you look at? Could you achieve a limit at 28 weeks, 24 weeks, 20 weeks? The amount of limits you could achieve are measured by the blockages and obstacles that fly in your face. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't think of gestational limits, could you think of other limits? Say, no abortions for eugenic reasons, or no abortions in various categories and descriptions. Could you say no abortion except, for parental notice or consent? Well, that wouldn't apply to adult abortions. You can devise all kinds of limits, but which makes sense and which can you enact or get in place? Right.
And I would sort of echo what you were saying when you took a look at William Wilberforce, because at the organization that I work for, we do extensive historical research whenever we're trying to come up with a new strategy or a new tactic, because Abraham Lincoln said history serves to remind us that our new ideas aren't new and aren't ours, so I always want to see who's tried this before. And I have not yet found a single social reform movement that fought an injustice that managed to do it completely in one fell swoop. Every single organization, every single movement, every single group I've come across has had to take a number of steps before they attained their desired goal. And I know that a lot of organizations currently are bandying about various different groups, such as the abolitionists, and saying that these groups didn't use any incremental strategies. But do you think it's a fair statement to say that no historical social reform movement has accomplished their ends in one fell swoop?
I don't know of any. I've never heard anyone point to any.
Right.
And it's because of you have to take, the essence of prudence is understanding the real world.
Right.
Understanding reality. You can have all kinds of wishes and goals and aspirations and desires, but prudence forces you to take account of reality. understand the real world. And the real world is that, I'm not slavishly devoted to incrementalism, but when I look around, and anybody makes progress by taking steps. Mm-hmm. And the question is, what steps and why, and how big a step can you take? Can you take a step that's a mile, or can you take a step that's 10 feet? What kind of steps can you take? And what it comes back to opportunities and obstacles. Mm-hmm. Do you understand your opportunities, and do you understand your obstacles?
Right. And often I find that opposition to any sort of legislation other than, a complete and total ban on abortion is what keeps many politicians away from dealing with pro-lifers in the first place, because they feel that nothing that they can practically come to the table with will ever be good. And what we have in Canada is a situation where many politicians feel that if they come forward with a piece of legislation that isn't a total ban on abortion, they're going to be targeted by a segment of the pro-life movement as well as by the radical pro-choice feminists. So it's turned the pro-life issue in many ways into this nuclear no man's land that no one can actually lay a hand on.
Well, that's one paradigm, but there's a different paradigm, and that is that if, let's say, a member of parliament proposes a 20-week limit on abortion, they may find 10 or 15% on the left opposing them. They may find 10 or 15% on the right opposing them. But they may find that 60 to 70% of Canadians like the idea.
Right. And public opinion is very much one of the frustrations with being Canadian pro-life activist, is just that, as you say, America is very out of line with public opinion in their abortion legislation, and so is Canada. We do have a large majority of Canadians who oppose late-term abortion, and yet no laws are forthcoming simply because the issue is deemed an unviable one and a nuclear one by many politicians. So I know I've seen quite a few of the articles that you've written about this issue. How do you respond when people say to you that taking a step-by-step approach is immoral? You've already addressed the idea of prudence, but how do you address when people say this on a very religious grounds?
It is not immoral to be limited by obstacles beyond your control. When you are limited in achieving the good by obstacles beyond your control, you're not responsible for what you can't achieve.
Right.
You're only responsible for what's within your power to achieve and what you have freedom to act. Mm-hmm. You're responsible for your freedom of action, but if you are blocked from achieving more of the good, you are not responsible for the good that you can't achieve because of obstacles beyond your control. Mm-hmm. And there is an assumption, there is an unreasonable assumption, an undocumentable assumption that you didn't achieve the perfect because of your own intent and desire, whereas the truth of it is you didn't achieve the perfect because of obstacles beyond your control, and you're not responsible for them.
Right.
You can't be held to account for the obstacles beyond your control. Mm-hmm. And it astonishes me that this absolutism doesn't apply to other social evils.
Right.
It seems to only apply in the pro-life context. I mean, Wilberforce worked for limits, but he didn't rest with any of the limits. He was always fighting for the next limit.
Right.
I mean, if he got a limit, on the number of slaves that could be carried on any one ship, he'd move on to the next limit.
Right.
He never rested, and the limits that he faced were always imposed by countervailing forces, and they were responsible for the lack of progress, not Wilberforce's desires or motives or intent.
Right. Well, looking looking forward at the abortion battle, and I know you've been following everything, as your books prove, quite closely in the U.S. for many, many years, and you've been a scholar in this area. What type of laws do you feel have been the most effective in the American context? Here in Canada, obviously, we not only have no laws restricting abortion, but we also fund abortion through our tax dollars, and we don't have parental consent. We've got bubble zones around all of our clinics. Like, we really have a country here in which the feminists of the sexual revolution and the abortion revolution in 1969 really won very, very completely, and now we're looking at different ways forward. What do you find has worked really effectively in the American context?
Well, I think generally you have to look for policies that will protect children and protect women's health. And we have a mother-child strategy. We cannot exclusively focus on just the child.
Right.
We also have to focus on protecting women's health, and we have to get out to the public the short-term and long-term risks to women's health from abortion.
Right.
There is a paradigm which may be still influential in Canada, as it was in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s, that abortion involved mother versus fetus.
Yes, very much.
Woman versus fetus. And we have to move public toward the paradigm that it's bad for both.
Right. Right.
Now, having said that, there are all kinds of limits that can be legislated in the interest of protecting children and unborn children and protecting women.
Mm-hmm.
Clinic regulations are important to protect women. Parental notice and consent is important for protecting minors.
Mm-hmm.
Public funding can be cut off because the public should not be compelled, no one should be compelled to use their tax dollars to support a social, what they consider a social evil. Clinic regulations are designed to protect women. Informed consent laws are important for making sure that women have full information about the nature, risks, and alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Ultrasound law as part of the informed consent process, or ultrasounds as part of the informed consent process,
right,
are important. But then, in addition, we work outside of the abortion area through prenatal injury law, wrongful death law, fetal homicide law, property law, to protect the unborn child as a human being or a person in those other areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As somebody has referred to it, to shine a spotlight on the schizophrenia between the abortion doctrine and the protection of the unborn child in these other areas.
Right. Right. The sort of psychological disconnect between what we know instinctively and intellectually about the preborn child in the womb and what we culturally believe about abortion.
Yes. And we've worked through the states. Frankly, I think that one of the obstacles you face, independent of any particular social issue, is you don't have a stronger federalist system in Canada. Mm-hmm. And you're limited by Parliament, and as Wilberforce was, that you've got one large legislative focus, and you can't work at the local level as much as we can in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, we are quite limited in that fashion.
That's been a plus in the U.S. system. Obama may control Washington, and the Senate may be controlled by Harry Reid, but we're able to work in the states for legal protection. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a difficulty you've got there.
Yeah, no, very much so. Yeah, just one final question is what's the one piece of advice you most like to give pro-lifers when they get into working in the political sphere? Because you've dealt with this issue very extensively. So what's the one piece of advice that you think should be taken to heart the most?
Politics is about differences. It's about spotlighting policy and that policy, the improvement between this policy and that policy, and drawing differences. And you're always explaining why this political figure is better than that one, and this policy is better than that one, and you have to explain why the protection of unborn children and the protection of women from abortion is better than the status quo.
Right.
And why informed consent is better than lack of informed consent. Why parental notice and consent is better than no parental notice or consent.
Right.
And you're always spotlighting those differences and explaining to the public those differences. But secondly, I would say that we are not responsible. We cannot be held to account for obstacles beyond our control.
Right.
And if you've got, if you've got 51 votes for a 20-week limit, but you have less than 50 votes for a 18-week limit, you go for the 20-week limit.
Right. Right.
To achieve the 18-week limit or some other imaginable limit, it's not because of your desire or lack of desire or motives or lack of courage. It's because of the obstacles flying in your face.
Right. Right. Well, everyone, that was Clarke Forsythe, the Senior Counsel for Americans United for Life and the author of the book Politics for the Greatest Good, The Case for Prudence in the Public Square, as well as The Abuse of Discretion, the inside story of Roe versus Wade. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we hope you'll join us again next week on the Bridgehead at 1:30 p.m. on Thursday. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great weekend.